especially to Sirajul sir for organizing this and for introducing the district department here. Welcoming me, it's been very special. Thank you, Josh Clark, sir. Thank you especially to the funders. I think this is a really special thing of Raja Koratha. Sirupari Chhatro Kendri একটা fund যেটা সামনে এসে কথা হতে থাকে 30 years. I can't stand still. হাতে নিয়ে আচ্ছা আমি শুরু করি আমি কিছু ইংলিশ বাংলা মিলিয়ে বলবো আমার বাংলা ইজ নট স্ট্রং এনাফ আমি পুরোটা বাংলায় বলতে পারবো মিলিয়ে যাবে আমি শুরু করি আজকের যে আমার টক আমার এখন কারেন্ট যে প্রজেক্ট চলছে ওখান থেকে নিয়ে এই প্রজেক্টের একটা sort of very tentative title Crafting an Economy East Bengal after 1947 after Partition crafting an economy বলতে আমি কি বুঝাচ্ছি আমি চেষ্টা করি বুঝিয়ে বলতে The map you see in front of you is a map of the colonial economy of Bengal and Assam. The colonial economic space, there's something called the British Indian colonial economy. Jute and tea is its lifeblood. Rail and steam is what connects it. Calcutta is its heart. It's a unified economy where GDP has been calculated in 1930 with its own currency, the British Indian rupee, with its own central bank. It's a real economic space. 1947 partition takes a fragment, a portion of that space and says, attack on Pakistan. Make a new economy out of this. There is a stretch of a railroad, a portion of a jute farm, a bit of a tea plantation. Create a new national economy. At this moment, in the mid-20th century, Nutun Desh, former European empires are becoming new countries, are coming into being as post-colonial nations. Every nation must have an economy. It's kind of the form of the nation. Each nation has to have a central bank, a currency, GDP figures, statistics. This is the modular form of the nation, which is more or less decided in the 1944 Bretton Woods conference, where the World Bank and IMF are set up. So as each country becomes independent, they're all faced with similar challenge. How do I take my imperial inheritance, the things that the colonial empires have left behind, and how do I give it a new shape, a new force, a new meaning, as a post-colonial economy? So that's maybe a little, I don't know, it's a bit vague, it's a bit abstract. So maybe if I go down into actual things, actual history, it will make more sense. What I argue is that the economy has to be produced, economies has to be made, right? This new countries come into being, there's to create this new economy. A Pakistan economy, an East Bengal economy has to be created afresh. The economy is created in two domains simultaneously. One is the domain of ideas, intellectual history, a domain of imagining the economy. I think that we can publish white papers, for example, of imagining economies. We had been told that Bangladesh is an economic miracle. We saw the GDP figures for it. We discussed the economy amongst ourselves, using all these numbers and discourses, but it was a made-up thing, right? It wasn't something that is actually tangibly real. It's something that exists in discourse. It's an object of knowledge, it's something that is represented. The economy is doing well, the economy is sick, the economy is robust. We talk about it full of physical attributes and things, but really it's an abstraction. There is no such thing called the economy. The economy has been produced as an idea. The idea of the Pakistan economy has been produced through intellectual work, through books, through economists collecting statistics and producing GDP figures, through people speculating on what this economy is about. So I have 4 books up here, and I suggest that these books are how the Pakistan economy was produced as an idea. Prothomta hoche Ambedkar, Partition in Pakistan, or the Partition of India, where Ambedkar for 3 pages calculates in 1941, much before Pakistan is created, what will be Pakistan's resources. And he produces a formula. Pakistan's resources equal so much land mass, so much population, so much government revenue. This is the first time that the idea of the Pakistan economy is expressed. Pakistan economy is This idea is then developed and further refined through more and more intellectuals, academics, social scientists. And I'll go into a bit more detail, but how this idea is produced through books. How the idea of Pakistani economy is first created as an intellectual idea, through books, through the work of economists. But the economy is also produced with a material. And I want to look at both, right? The production of the idea of the Pakistani economy through statistics, through tables, through graphs, through books, and the production of the Pakistani economy as a material element. So in my larger project, it's based on 3 case studies of how the Pakistani economy is formed on the ground, out of real things. And the 3 case studies are steamships, colonial steamboats, which are left behind by the British Empire, which ran from Calcutta through the Shojan and the Meghna to Assam, and as I'll go into a bit more detail about steamships, are actually owned and operated by British companies. And I look at how steamships are partitioned, between India and Pakistan, how workers are partitioned, how routes and fleets are partitioned, how companies are partitioned. I look at the borders, and I particularly look at the borders between the hills and the plains. And I look at how colonial borders get new meaning in new national economies. I'll come back to borders in just a second. And the third case study, the 3 case studies, steamships, the borders between the hills and the plains. The third case study is the village homestead, Grameen Vita Valley. And I'm interested in how, and particularly Grameen Vita Valley of refugees and migrants. And I'm interested in how the 2 states, the post-colonial Indian Pakistani states, try to divide the value of homestead assets. So what they do with the value of fish in ponds, the fruit trees and fruit, timber, corrugated iron and roofs, and how really sort of nitty-gritty negotiations over homestead value and how you divide it. Hills and plains, I love this thing of, I don't know how many, the topographic, if you look at a topographical map of Bangladesh, the attention to detail with which every single elevation is carved out of Bangladesh is remarkable. They went through with surgical precision, and if there's a little bit of elevation that gets put in India, or Tripura or Assam, and if it's flatland it goes into. And if you look at the Tripura border with Kumilla and Noakhali, and particularly the Chabolnaya Peninsula jutting out, it's like literally like kut kore, every little bit. These are very old borders. The Sylhet Meghalaya border is from 1792. The Kumilla Tripura border is from 1830. And the British drew these borders literally to separate their own dominion in the plains, and the hills were supposed to be native, uncivilized, wild spaces where there were native rulers. Of course, history proceeds, and then in 1947, those very borders become the India-Pakistan borders. And now, a new national economy has to be created out of those borders. I won't go into the Tripura story, I'm happy to talk about it later. The Tripura story is one of forests and farms. On the Tripura side of the border were Indian forests. On the Bangladesh side of the border, the Pakistan side of the border were jute and rice farms. And there's a lot of violence on the border about forest encroachments, about grazing cattle in Tripura forest. The closure of the commons is a story of the forest there. What I try to do in these 3 case studies is I try to show a process where the Indian and Pakistani governments went into these spaces, into these environments, and dismantled. They dismantled them into units of capital and workers, into individual pieces of property, individual pieces of land, and individual commodities. And they assigned those units a citizenship. This is a Pakistani worker, this is an Indian worker. This is a Pakistani property, this is an Indian property. This is a Pakistani tree, this is an Indian tree. This is a Pakistani pond, there's an Indian pond. And then they tried to, once they divided these units between them, they had to reorganize these units into a new shape, into a new form, the Pakistani economy, which would produce revenue for the Pakistani state, which would produce surplus value for the Pakistani government. So it was a very big project, right? To go through the colonial economy level by level, take it apart, assign every bit of citizenship, put it back together and move forward. So in the material world, they're doing this. In the intellectual world, they're trying to come up with formulas, numbers, statistics, descriptions for something that hasn't yet existed, the Pakistan. The book moves back and forth between this intellectual history of the production of the Pakistani economy and the material history of the lived lives of partition in these spaces. But I'm going to, for the talk, I'm going to focus on two things. I'm not going to take hopefully a lot of time. I want to talk about, first, the debates of faith. In the 1940s, even before Pakistan was created, there's a very long and very heated intellectual debate about whether or not Pakistan will be economically viable. And in addressing this debate, various scholars, well-known economists, well-known historians, come up with numbers. They make tests. They calculate how much government revenue the new Pakistani government would get. They calculate what would be the likely exports of the new Pakistani government. So they try to address this question of economic viability. And in addressing the question of economic viability, they imagine a Pakistani economy. So I'll talk about the debates on economic viability during the 1940s as my example of the intellectual production of the idea of the economy. And I'll talk about the partition of steamships, about river steamers after 1947, to talk about the material creation of the economy. So there'll be one part intellectual creation, other part material creation, and I'll try and go back and I'll try and think a little bit, I guess, about how we can relate the two. But I'm actually looking for help from you to understand how to relate the intellectual idea of the economy. So the imagined economy. How did the idea of the Pakistani economy get produced even before there was a Pakistani state? Let's begin with the Lahore Resolution, like I guess all history of Pakistan. In 1940, the Lahore Resolution, which many of you know about, also known as the Pakistan Resolution, proposes the creation of a state or states of territories with Muslim majority areas with territorial reorganization, which will have autonomy and sovereignty, but we don't know to what degree. So it proposes a territorial autonomous sovereign state, but it's very vague. It's left undefined. Territory is left undefined. The degree of sovereignty is left undefined. The number of states is left undefined. Nowhere do they even call it Pakistan. That's because the Muslim League was trying to use this resolution to bring together South Asia's diverse Muslims into a single platform. They had to accommodate very many different ideas of what freedom and sovereignty meant for Indian Muslims. So they came up with something vague and imprecise, so they can include many people. People can give it different meanings. But what it did, this vague, imprecise resolution, is it opened the door to the Muslim League's political opponents. They looked at it and said, well, would a state comprised of Muslim majority territory be economically viable? Would this kind of a state, where you take the British Empire, take Muslim majority territories, put it back together, would it be economically possible? Would such a state be able to defend its borders? Would such a state be able to raise enough taxes to pay its employees? Would such a state? So they really they tried to discredit the Lahore Resolution with the debate on economic, by raising the question of economic viability. The economic viability question then was taken up by experts, by social scientists, by economists, who tried to answer, who tried to evaluate it scientifically, who waded through colonial statistics and so forth to try and measure and give an accurate an accurate estimation of what would Pakistan's economy look like. In the process, they produced a scholarly bibliography. A scholarly bibliography on the Pakistani economy, even before the Pakistani state was created, even before the Pakistani state's borders were known, even before we knew whether or not there would be a Pakistani state. A student could, a researcher could, go to a library and take a 5-post and tell you that the Pakistani economy will have this many steel mills, it will produce this much jute. It doesn't exist, but the books exist. The idea of the economy preceded any material reality of the economy. Let me go into a bit more detail on some, well actually let me tell you the story of the publishing book. There's a huge I guess the whole resolution's imprecise language, negotiations between the Muslim League and the Congress are going on. There's a huge demand for expert-authored books in Pakistan. There's a complete publishing boom on books in Pakistan by social scientists. The first of the books months after the Lahore Resolution, is India's problem of a future constitution, All India Muslim League Lahore Resolution, an unbiased scientific and analytical study. This is that, I mean, that's the phrase I'm going to draw your attention to. It's a little booklet, contains 22 articles, speeches, Jinnah's welcome address, that looks very rapidly, hurriedly put together by an image Sayyid of Malabar Hill, who I think was a very smart businessman, who sensed a market opportunity. There was a demand for, there was public confusion, there was public interest, there's a readership that wants to know what's happening, they want expert voices clarifying it. He saw the market, he came out with a pamphlet. This sparks a publishing boom on books on Pakistan. Books on Pakistan are like one of the big sort of publishing boom segments or sectors of the 1940s, if you will. Ambedkar's Thoughts on Pakistan, the first edition, is the renamed edition that I have displayed there. Published 1941 November. First high-profile expert to write a book on Pakistan. It's a bestseller. It goes into 3 editions. The second edition is renamed Thoughts on Pakistan, right? Nice, vague title, kind of like, I have my thoughts. It's Partition, Pakistan or the Partition of India. It's a marketing decision to change the title. The edition here carries a marketing tag which reads, let me just get this out. Of the many books on the subject, there is none that is either the breadth or the depth that this has. Of the many books, they're really pushing their books. You want to beat another person's book. You want someone to buy your book than someone else's book. Ambedkar's first edition has a wonderful line in the introduction, which is, every Indian must read a book on Pakistan. If not this, then some other, if he wants to help his country steer a clear path. So the publishing industry has rushed into books. Him Kitabs is a Bombay-based pro-Congress publisher. They started a series of books called the New India series, where they got the country's leading academics to write short pamphlets on the future of Pakistan. I put Radha Kamal Mukherjee's An Economist Looks at Pakistan there, but the back page of that pamphlet includes advertisements for other books in the series. Beni Prasad's Communal Settlement, and B.B. Kulkarni's Is Pakistan Necessary? Him Kitabs also brings out Rajendra Prasad's India Divided, also a bestseller. Goes into, published in 1945, into a 3rd edition by 1947 June, and maybe Ambedkar's main competitor in the market. But the market is full of these books on Pakistan, and everyone is out rushing to get their book on Pakistan done. One of the major topics in this expert literature, publishing boom and expert literature, is the topic of economic viability. Would Pakistan's economy be viable? Let me begin, it posed as a hypothesis. Experts are supposed to scientifically evaluate the question. I quote from Reginald Copeland, who is the White Professor of Oxford History and one of the many contributors to the bibliography on the Pakistani economy. He writes, in stating the case for Pakistan, it has been assumed that it would be financially practicable for the Muslim states to pay their own separate way. That assumption now must be put to the test. And he devises a very statistical test. He calculates, he goes through the budgets of all the provinces, the central government, he takes the figures apart, and he kind of comes up with a new figure. Pakistan, that would be created, would have this much revenue, this much expense. And he compares it to, and he says, they could pay for their basic existence, but they won't be able to pay for the military to defend their borders. Hence, Pakistan is economically unviable. Ambedkar's method Copeland's method of statistical kind of budget calculations is extended by further economists. So in typical literature, Copeland, Ambedkar have done this well. Subsequent scholars cite them, use their method, and then extend it. They incorporate more data to refine their statistical methods, and they come up with even more and more detailed descriptions of the Pakistani economy. By the time the last book on that series of books, Basic Facts Relating to Hindustan and Pakistan for 2 rupees, published in June 1947, is basically a book that is tables. It's table after table after table. The number of tanneries in Hindustan and Pakistan, the number of steel mills in Hindustan and Pakistan, most of the time Pakistan is zero, right? The number of sugar mills in Hindustan and Pakistan, the number of sawmills in Hindustan and Pakistan, the production of sesame in Hindustan and Pakistan, the production of timber in Hindustan, and it's on and on and on and on. A book that just table and table and table about countries that don't yet exist, about countries that don't actually exist yet. What this literature, what this production of scholarly bibliography, the production of Pakistani economy, the production of bibliography and scholarship, what scholarship does, and what perhaps all of us in this room or scholars do, is we marginalize and exclude certain ways of thinking. We don't we don't cite certain kinds of literature. We cite certain kinds of literature only to dismiss it. There's certain ideas, as this literature developed and honed this statistical way of measuring the Pakistani economy from colonial statistics, taking it apart, putting it back together, coming up with new numbers, there were other ways of thinking of the Pakistani economy that got disregarded. As this scholarship picked up on the Congress's claim that Pakistan will be economically viable, they did not pick up on the pro-Pakistan claim, the economic case for Pakistan, that Pakistan would constitute liberation, economic emancipation for Indian Muslims from both British capitalist domination and Hindu capitalist domination. This idea of economic liberation does not make it into the scholarly bibliography that I've cited thus far, nor does the idea that liberation will unleash Pakistan's potential. It's different. It's not going to be just a fragment of the colonial economy. It will be something completely different from the colonial economy. These ideas are marginalized, are basically excluded from the growing literature. These two books, pamphlets, and one, I'll come to them, are perhaps literature that doesn't get as much mention, as much citation as Copeland or Ambedkar or Modi and Mathai and the other texts I described earlier. These are pro-Pakistan texts presenting an economic case for Pakistan. The first two are written by two professors of Islamia College, Calcutta, a real center of Pakistan thought, in a Bengali Muslim Pakistan thought. Sheikh Mujib was a student there. Abu Hashim would give his lectures on Islamic socialism there. It was a real center. The first pamphlet is written by M. Sadiq, professor of economics at Islamia College, and published in 1944, along by Mujibur Rahman Khan of East Pakistan Renaissance Society, as a short pamphlet, kind of not a very impressive publication, if you will. The second is a much more substantive book written by Nafis Ahmed, who would become the founder of the geography department in Dhaka University here, and a long-running presence. His economic geography of East Bengal, later Bangladesh, is one of those texts that probably has many generations of geography students who had to read that, I suspect. But Nafis Ahmed wrote his Basis of Pakistan in May 1947, published by Packer Spink and Company, one of Calcutta's leading English language publishers, forward by Surawardi, and a much more sort of substantive book, if you will. He also doesn't get, Eastern Pakistan, this pamphlet and the other literature is basically cited to be dismissed, if it is cited at all. Nafis Ahmed's book, it's probably too late. It's published too late in the scholarly production to shape the idea of the Pakistani economy before partition. It's May 1947. What both these authors do is they focus on things like how much can agricultural productivity be raised with scientific agricultural programs. They don't take colonial statistics and just repurpose them in the new Pakistan statistics. They talk about potential and promise. They talk about the amount of coal that could be found under. There's a lot of mineral dreams. There's a lot of dreams of how much minerals are just underneath the soil, waiting to be discovered. There are a lot of discussion on let me find a quote, which is always better than this. Immense deposits of coal, oil, and metals, potentials for generating hydroelectricity and increasing agricultural productivity, and developing new industries in iron and steel, heavy chemicals, cement, paper, leather, and other sectors. If you read Nafis Ahmed's book, it reads like a wish list, a 5-year plan. We will. Nafis Ahmed's, and it's very different from the earlier approach, right? The earlier approach is about like measuring the Pakistani economy as a fraction, a fragment of the colonial economy. This approach is about imagining a future economy that's radically transformed from the earlier kind of formations. For both Nafis Ahmed and Sadiq, it's the state which will play a socialist Islamic state will play a powerful transformative role. But I want to quote a little bit at length from Nafis Ahmed because he writes his book as a direct response to the scholars I cited earlier, a direct response to those who are trying to prove Pakistan's economic viability. He says, I quote, "This work is primarily an answer to those who try to prove that geographically and economically the Pakistan demand is fantastic. The geographical evidence amply demonstrates that these lands will be no mere backward agricultural region, as is customarily declared by some prejudiced politicians, who assert that such resultant fragments of India, constituting themselves into separate sovereign states, would be so small in area, so poor in population, so lacking in resources, that there will be no hope for them of intensive industrialization and consequent betterment in the standard of living of people." His book is intended as a response to that, and his real response, as I understand it, is he thinks that Pakistan's critics lack imagination. He thinks that Pakistan's critics look at the way things are and imagine that they will be this way forever. I quote again from Nafis Ahmed. "Economically, the Pakistan lands are stamped with poverty and backwardness. And what is most interesting is the fact that the picture of the present economic conditions is regarded as immutable. Their revenues today are small, therefore Pakistan areas will not be able to bear the burden of independent existence. Many provide a highly distorted picture of the industrial resources of Pakistan, which are declared to be doomed as pastoral, come agricultural regions." This is the counter-narrative that doesn't get it. No economist comes in and says, what does economic emancipation of India's Muslims look like? No economist comes in and calculates what is the value of the surplus extracted from the Muslim peasantry by shopkeepers. No one comes in and says, what would be the impact of nationalizing the entire jute industry? This is the unexplored debate on the Pakistani economy, which is about potential and transformation. Instead, the discourse that wins is a discourse that sees the Pakistani economy as a fragment of an existing colonial economy, not as a post-colonial transformed space. The third text there is an interesting one, because it is not the Muslim case for Pakistan, but rather the neoliberal case for Pakistan, published in The Economist in May 1947. Will Pakistan work? Good title, right? The Economist, surprisingly, The Economist magazine, as part of its if you were the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is a paying subscription, so you pay a huge amount of money and they deliver to you confidential reports for your eyes only. They predict Pakistan will work because when Pakistan separates from India, all industries will leave Calcutta and these centers and go to East Pakistan to be closer to sources of raw material. And that will result in transformations of the Pakistani economy. It won't remain agriculturally backward forever, but industries will go there because the raw materials are there. The colonial government takes this report very seriously. They take it very seriously. They prepare counters, they prepare responses. They say this is ridiculous, this is wrong. Calcutta, they don't understand how established Calcutta is. This will never happen. And this counter that they prepare actually says, economically, East Bengal it is not possible economically for East Bengal to survive. The British bureaucrat sending that note on, forwarding that note to someone else, makes a note on the note saying, I disagree, I'm slightly more optimistic about the future of East Pakistan than the author is. So there's real doom and gloom about what East Bengal will look like. Deep doom and gloom. Especially as the decision to take Calcutta away is gone, the way in which scholarship has created this idea of an economy as a fragment of something bigger has created a notion that Pakistan, East Bengal particularly, is doomed. The first quote is from Abu Hashim, and he gives this to the Millet, which is the Muslim League's newspaper. He comes out of the Legislative Council, having voted for partition, and he tells them that, he gave the partition vote out of fear rather than hope. And he says, this is his prediction for what partition will do to East Pakistan, right? Eastern Pakistan will be mainly reliant on Jews. This is probably the most densely populated region in the entire world. At any time, artificial Jews might be invented, and if that happens, it will be a disaster. In this situation, Eastern Pakistan will probably develop as a good market for American manufactured goods. America might give us loans if we have to buy American cigarettes and other goods to repay them. Neocolonialism. It's a description of neocolonialism from 1947, right? Well before Nkrumah wrote it. And it's a description of neocolonialism as a prediction of what an East Bengal economy would look like. The second quote is from Jinnah. It's Jinnah's interview with Mountbatten. Jinnah's been told about the United Independent Bengal scheme with Abu Hashim and Surawati and Tariq trying to create a brief attempt to keep Bengal one separate independent country. And Jinnah tells Mountbatten, if Bengal remains united, I should be delighted. What is the use of Bengal without Calcutta? Then much better to remain united and independent. What is the use of Bengal without Calcutta? Let me just take a little pause for water. This is the intellectual. This is the. So this is one story of the intellectual production, right? The production of the idea of the Pakistani economy. In the book, I continue the story beyond 47. I look at first the production of propaganda literature by the Pakistani Foreign Department in foreign countries, telling the world how great their economy is doing, how much their economy is growing, and if you're an American investor, now is the time to come and invest. They write things like, actually, I'll just show you. East Bengal shares Pakistan's planned progress. We all know that it did no such thing, but the propaganda literature is the second phase. I go into the fantasized Pakistani economy as propaganda. And I also look at Pakistan's membership to the IMF, which is a drawn-out process that goes from 47 to 50. What's really interesting, so basically IMF membership requires there's a formula in IMF membership. Each country gets a reserve. The amount of your reserves is your voting rights. But the quantity of the reserve is calculated as, and I'm not going to remember the formula, it's very complicated, some fraction of GDP plus some fraction of variation in international trade, plus some fraction of foreign reserve balances before World War II. There was no Pakistan before World War II. You can't have those things. So basically, for 3 years, IMF economists and Pakistani economists go back and forth endlessly. Is Pakistan's GDP this big or that big? Is its exports this much or that? Should Pakistan's economy be about Egypt, same size as Egypt, or is it a bit smaller? Is Pakistan 1/6 of British India's economy, or 1/7? All of this to generate estimates. Just imagining an economy, right? It's not an economy that actually exists. We don't have the data. We don't know the statistics collection institutions haven't been set up yet, right? But we're guessing what an economy is. This intellectual work, of course, has very real effects, right? It has very, very real. So that's the intellectual story. I'll move now to the material story, to steamships, to steamers and the colonial economy. It's going to be, I hope it works, but I feel like there's very different stories that I'm trying to put together, and it might be a little bit. Here it goes. At the time of partition and independence, 2 London-headquartered publicly held companies, the India General Navigation and the River Steam Navigation, operated a monopoly on coal-powered steamers on the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna. The British shareholders of 2 companies owned 1,177 vessels,
2 Calcutta dockyards, riverside docks, warehouses and ticketing agencies and residences in 324 river ports. Narayanganj, Sirajul, Odisha, all these things. 320, so it's a huge operation. They employed a float staff, and the float staff is the lashkars and captains and pindals and sukkani will go into this. Of 16,000 people who work on the ships, who maneuver the ships, and they employed an onshore staff, ticket collectors, headquarter workers, repairmen, porters, of 20,000 people. In 1947, the year of partition and independence, these 2 British companies transported over 12 million passengers, 450,000 tons of jute, and 140,000 tons of tea through Bengal and Assam's rivers. These 2 colonial steamer companies were critical to the colonial economic space. Their route from Calcutta to East ran south from Calcutta. You make a hard sort of east into the Sundarbans. You go through the Sundarbans, come out at Khulna, and from Khulna you join the highways of the Podda, Meghna, Jamuna. Some of the vessels would go up the Brahmaputra into Assam. Some of the vessels would go up, down the vessel would come to Goalanda at the confluence of the Podda and the Jamuna, and where the train from Calcutta would stop. So they would meet the train from Calcutta at Goalanda. Some of the vessels would go up to Assam, up the Brahmaputra, Jamuna. Some of the vessels would come down the Podda to Chatpur, Narayanganj. Some of them would go on from Chatpur, Narayanganj through the Meghna, past Karimganj to Kachar. They rail and river interconnected. You take a journey from Calcutta to Dhaka, a journey from Calcutta to anywhere in East Bengal would involve changing from one to the other, sometimes several times. You take a train to Goalanda, you shift to a steamer, you get off at Narayanganj, you take another train up from Narayanganj to Ramsey. Or you get there. So it was very, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is they were critical to infrastructure. They were KPI. The steamer companies were key infrastructure. The steamer companies is what were critical to the jute and the tea and the money and the workers flowing for the colonial economy to work. Like many other colonial concerns, the steamer company stayed on after partition and independence. Why did they stay on? 1976 history of steamer companies, commissioned by the steamer companies themselves, says that the steamer company stayed on, I quote, "The companies had assumed that East Pakistan would economically threaten them. The decision to stay on was perhaps because the companies had been misled by Congress propaganda into believing that Pakistan would not last. They had believed that East Pakistan would collapse, these wars would disappear, the old economy would go on, so might as well stay in business. Our old routes from Calcutta would continue." But they did stay on, and they continued to run their business. Upon partition, India and Pakistan set about dividing the colonial companies between their respective national economies. They partitioned colonial capital. And I want to describe this partition of colonial capital. Still owned by 2 British companies, still with shareholders in London, still with its managing headquarters in Calcutta. These 2 companies are now operating through India and Pakistan, transporting tea, jute, and workers as if partition hasn't happened, as if partition is yet. The first signs that partition is happening, that the rivers have been partitioned, is the trade restrictions. India declares Pakistan a foreign country for trade purposes in April 1948. When they do, immediately, and Pakistan responds saying, okay, you're also a foreign country now. And they both impose a slew of duties and tariffs on goods, trade restrictions and so forth. And they, on the rivers, where the borders slash across rivers, they create customs stations in river port towns. So a steamer going through, say, up the Brahmaputra into Assam will now stop at Chilmali, where Pakistani customs officials would board the ship, would inspect documents, would check the cargo, would search passengers' luggage, to see if they're carrying contraband and so forth. This imposition of borders, of trade restrictions, is about differentiating cargo, about commodities. What is a Pakistani commodity and what is an Indian commodity? Is the gold you have in your luggage, is it Pakistani or Indian? This is what is decided at every border crossing. Should it stay or should it go? Is it allowed to go, is it not? Partitioning, the first kind of impact of partition. 1949, the devaluation crisis. I want this, it's a complicated history. Briefly put, India devalued its rupee, Pakistan did not. Pakistan and India's rupee came to have different values for the first time since partition. India refused to recognize Pakistan, the value of Pakistan's rupee. All trade came to a stop. All official economic relations came to a stop. But what this was, again, another critical moment, the partition of currencies. With the devaluation of with the non-devaluation of Pakistani rupee, different values for Pakistani and Indian rupees, it mattered whether you're remunerated in Indian or Pakistani rupees, right? If you are working on a ship and you're crossing borders, it matters which currency you're carrying. If you are buying a ticket in Dhaka to go to Calcutta, should you pay Pakistani rupees or Indian rupees? The division of currencies, again, is something that affects the companies and their operations. Devaluation crisis results in the complete breakdown of economic relations between India and Pakistan. After the devaluation crisis, India and Pakistan commit to completely to separating their economies, to going much more aggressive in separating their economies. In 1950, Pakistan passes a law that all corporations, all companies operating in East Bengal must have headquarters in East Bengal. Prior to that, the headquarters were in Calcutta, decisions were made in Calcutta. Even the Islamic the big industrial concerns of East Bengal were operating out of Calcutta. They were first to move their headquarters after 1950. The steamer companies are forced to split their managing agencies, their corporate structures into two. There's a Pakistan subsidiary and an India subsidiary. 1950, India and Pakistan amend their inland vessel act. They stipulate that steamers must be registered in the country in which it spends the most time. The companies now split their steamer fleets, which is an Indian steamer, which is a Pakistani steamer. What they do is they split their fleets into two. Steamers on the long distance Calcutta to Assam voyage are Indian steamers. Ships on the go along the Jodhpur passenger route are Pakistani steamers. And ships that are going to the new developing short distance routes between Narayanganj, Khulna, and Chittagong are Pakistan steamers. They divide their fleets. In 1953, the State Bank of Pakistan refuses to permit the companies to take an advance until and unless they produce a separate profit and a loss account for Pakistan operations. Now they're to separate their accounts, because they've been the companies have been behaving as if there's one account with the same profits and losses in Pakistan and India. Now they can produce separate profit and loss accounts. In this way, one by one, each policy forces the companies to set up two completely separate operations with different fleets, different routes, different corporate management structures, different finance loss accounts, different assets, different contracts with workers. Workers also, the union representation of workers changed, I'm not getting into that yet. They partitioned colonial capital. They partitioned colonial companies between India and Pakistan. It's not that, they did what I want to emphasize, they partitioned colonial capital. They didn't nationalize colonial capital. They didn't take over colonial capital. It retained its colonial character right through till 1971. The story of, I'll just tell a little bit before I continue with the partition story about the fate of IJNRS in East Bengal. In East Bengal, the IJNRS had really struggled. They struggled to compete with they had built up their monopoly through colonial state giving them favors backing. They've lost the backing of the colonials. Their business strengths were long distance routes between Calcutta and Assam and very large ships. The new East Bengal economy needed smaller ships that could make a lot more voyages back and forth between shorter distances.
the company's vessels and business wasn't suited. And what happened in East Bengal in particular was lots and lots and lots of small steamer companies started emerging, often with the decommissioned vessels of their own vessels. Somebody, a local businessman, would buy one of their vessels and run one route back and forth. Say from Shojan to Conference, they would run one route back and forth. And the companies couldn't compete against that trade. They just couldn't compete. The company's business kept going down. 1960, companies are facing bankruptcy. They're about to go bankrupt. The Pakistani government steps in, and the Gaudian government is because they don't nationalize it. They form a new company called Pakistan River Steamers with one-third ownership. One-third ownership by the River Steam Navigation, one-third ownership by the India General Navigation, the colonial companies, and one-third ownership by the government of East Bengal. This company runs through to 1971, when it is finally nationalized. When the Pakistan River Steamers is nationalized as the Bangladesh Inland Water Transport Authority. In 1977, 6 years after independence, the London shareholders, the British shareholders of IG and RSM get compensation for nationalization. That's how long these colonial companies operate. The partition of capital, the decolonization of capital, whatever you want to call it. So this story is a story of from above, the making of the Pakistani economy from above. It's policymakers, state policymakers, bureaucrats, company officials. It's not a socialist reform. What I'm really interested in is the story from the other side, the story from the steamer crews, the people who worked on the vessels, and how they experienced partition, and how they potentially shaped the Pakistani economy. The company's vessels were captained and crewed by an almost exclusively East Bengali Muslim labor force, majority of whom had homes in the Meghna estuary, a portion of the wider belt of the wider Lashkar belt of East Bengal. These men provided the labor and skill necessary to maneuver iron and coal through Bengal and Sams rivers. Unlike on oceanic steamers, East Bengali sailors rose to ranks of command on the river steamers. Masters, who were in command of speedboats, and serangs in command of flats. The steamers would tug flats, which were like commanding flats. So serangs are captains of flats, masters are commanders of boats. Masters and serangs and drivers. Drivers are people who are in charge of the engine, of making sure the engine moves right. They were called the certified ranks, because they had to sit an exam and get the certificate, and they were well paid, had provident funds, elite laborers, middle class laborers. The largest vessels used by the companies were manned by anywhere between 40 and 50 crew members. Crew members were arranged in a hierarchy of functions and designations. Deck crews consisted of tyndals, first mates, manifest clerks in charge of cargo, tallymen in charge of keeping accounts, sukannis, helmsmen, kassabs, storekeepers, bhandaris, cooks, and at the very bottom of the hierarchy, lashkars, who served at the will of their superiors. Engine crews worked below deck to keep the coal-powered engines running, and there were also hired guys. Drivers who were commanding lightmen, greasers, firemen, and coal trimmers. The certified ranks constituted an elite labor force with free medical care, provident funds, paid leave, and private living quarters aboard vessels. Lashkars slept on the decks or amongst the luggage. For the steamer crews, the partition of the joint companies implied a division of their employers and workplaces. Some of them ended up working on Indian registered vessels on an Indian company. Some of them ended up working on Pakistani registered vessels for a Pakistani company. But even as they were divided between the companies, they themselves remained Pakistani. In fact, they became even more Pakistani because they were given passports now to prove they were Pakistani. Despite these, so what I wanted to, my project looks at 3 strikes by steamer crews in response to the partition of their nation, in response to the partition of their workforce, as attempts to shape the terms on which the labor was going to be partitioned between India and Pakistan. I'm not going to, I think I must be I look at three strikes, and I'll tell them very fast. The first strike is Chilmani, February 1950. The way the strike happens is, so there's February 1950, there are communal riots in East Bengal, West Bengal, Assam, and Tripura. The vessels going up the Brahmaputra, they reach Chilmani, and the crews of the vessels say, no, we're not going to cross to India. We're not going to cross to India, it's unsafe, we might be killed. More and more vessels that come and stop with another group of vessels stop at Khulna, going towards Calcutta. They stop at Khulna and say, no, we're not going to go any further. The companies fly in their officials and say, how do we resume sailing, start negotiations. The BMU arrives. Their main complaint, the main complaint of the crews is harassment and oppression by border guards, by petty border officials, which I like the description. So what happens because of the devaluation crisis, because of the stricter customs policies, ship's crews are finding that their stores of cash and food that they need to keep the vessel running are seized at the border. They're finding that, and this may be, their main complaints about cloth, food, and currency. The complaint about cloth may be that they were actually smuggling cloth, I don't know. Because it's an opportunity, of course, to move stuff across. But their real complaint was about being harassed. And they only resumed sailings in about 2 weeks later, by which time over 100 ships had been stopped, after a guarantee from the companies that the company will organize India and Pakistan to sit together and make peace and allow for these currencies to resume. So obviously that didn't happen. But a wildcat strike against borders is the first of the strikes I talk about. The second strike in Jagannathganj has the division of the unions as the basis of it. The Bengal Mariners Union was the representative of the steamship crews during the colonial period, and after 1947. The Mariners Union, leadership relocated to East Bengal, to Narayanganj, after 1947, creating a leadership vacuum in Calcutta. A person in Calcutta by the name of Mansoor Jilani challenged the old leadership that is now in the absentee leadership of the Mariners Union, and he tried to get control of the union. The companies refused to negotiate with him. He launched a strike in order to get the companies to recognize his leadership and force the companies to negotiate with them. The companies recognized him. The strike was called off everywhere except in one place. Ships returning from Assam to Calcutta, the Tariq is the first, stopped at a port called Jagannathganj, which is on the Jamuna, the Mymensingh side of Jamuna, just across Sirajul, and said, we're going to stop work. And other ships joined it, only of the Indian-owned companies. These ships formed a picket line across the Jamuna. They literally formed a picket line where they would only stop Indian-owned ships but allow the Pakistani ships to pass. And the companies were forced to come in and negotiate, and they were forced to exceed their demands. What I argue is the net result of this was a further partition of the terms of work between Indian and Pakistani vessels. Because the Indian vessels struck so successfully and so spectacularly, they got a really good deal from the company. And that deal was not extended to the Pakistani workforce. It was only for the Indian workforce. The third strike I looked at much later, in 1963. And this is a massive strike, again by the Indian companies. And it's Indian ships, Pakistani sailors, stopped their boats along at every river port. Almost every river port in East Bengal has IGN, RSN ships stopped. The workers' demands this time are really the demands of migrant workers. They demand half their wages should be paid in Pakistani rupees. They demand that they should be recruited in Pakistan rather than being made to travel to Calcutta to find work. They demand that the companies establish a welfare center in Dhaka or Narayanganj, which would process visas and passports for them. It's very much like the demands. You read them and you think this could be the demands of migrant workers today. To me, what that shows is that the Indian economy and the Pakistani economy has come into formation. We now know who was a Pakistani worker and who was an Indian worker. We now have laws which regulate what a Pakistani worker must do to go to India and work and taxes that must be paid. And this is really the identity of the migrant worker kind of really forming the sign of how successful the companies had, if you will, partitioned the two economies. So this is I guess, the material story of the economy. I did want to say one thing about, before I move on from the material. The two quotes, I think, one is from this 1963 strike. One of the company officials, really frustrated. It's an 8-week strike. 8 weeks the company's vessels are stopped. The IGN goes bankrupt as a result of that strike and is bought up by the RSF for a nominal sum of 1 rupee. One of the IGN officials says, describing their helplessness, "This is a strike by Pakistani workers on Indian vessels owned by British companies while in Pakistani waters," which to me is a great kind of formula of partition of economies, right? And the kind of economic partition was carried out. I did want to leave this, just go let's mention this quickly, mainly because, those of us who study social history from colonial sources, we really don't get to know much about the people who we write about, steamer crews. Steamer crews don't actually have a record in the colonial archives. These are impressions of striking crews written down by officials who interviewed them. And I love them because there's such, the colonial casting, the way in which racial colonial casting works. So, Karibal Mola, Manifest of the Taraqi from Noakhali, is assumed to be the strike leader, is assumed to be the brains behind the operation. Small stature and not altogether unengaging appearance. He speaks good English. Muhammad Ali, Sukani at the Abada, 22 years in company service, is thought to be the strong man of the strikers. This man was rather insolent, and I would say a bad type. He looked to me the type of individual with a rather vile nature, and would easily be a strike leader. From his appearance and manner, we would say he was a strong man of the committee, and that the manifest clerk of the Taraqi provided the brains. He looks and acts like a thug. Madamia, Lashkar of the flat Bunsi, again, like a colonial official writing down their impressions. Rather unexpectedly, this man was a pleasant type. He was about 20 and told us quite openly that he was one of the volunteer strikers at Joggernaut Lodge. When he was told that we'd been informed that he was a commander of the volunteers, he smiled rather sheepishly and said that the others had followed and obeyed him, though he had not wanted to be their leader. The impression that we got was that most of the strike work that this individual had done was out of pure devilment. I just leave this because, it's nice to get a flavor of social history. It's an attempt to do social history from below. And it's an attempt to say that these figures, that the colonial government typecasts and stereotypes or whatever, are people who shape the national economy. The national economy isn't just imposed and imagined by intellectuals and policymakers and academics and corporate officials. It's shaped from below by happy-go-lucky Nedamia, by strongman Muhammad Ali, and by the brains Karibal Mola. They are the unwritten authors of what an economy is. I'm at the end, but I was just one. I think there was one more slide. So I was supposed to have one last slide, but I don't have it. But I'll just say it. The book ends with a 6-point demand. And the book ends with a 6-point demand. So I begin with the poverty debate, with the Pakistani propaganda and how good the economy is, with the IMF economy, imagining the economy through intellectual capacity. Then I move into material and social histories of spaces, people, and how the economy is created in the flesh. Then I move back to imagine the economies through the 6-point demand. The 3 demands of the 6-point demand, 3, 4, and 5. Separate currency, separate banks, separate foreign reserves. It is, in terms of thinking about what a national economy looks like in the 20th century, it's a very bold map. Nothing like this has been attempted. 2 economies, 1 state with 2 different separate currencies. This is possibilities of transformation. This is an economic possibility which it is like Nafis Ahmed writing perhaps in 1947, trying to imagine something that seems unimaginable. But yet, they did, right? So the last chapter which I want to write, John, I will get it right, the action will be here. A group of Dhaka University economists thinking about the economy that has been created through steamboat worker strikes, thinking about the economy that has been created through the division of homesteads, thinking about the economy that has been created in these material ways, and trying to make sense of it. And in trying to make sense of it, coming up with the two-nation theory, coming up with the internal colony theory, coming up with ways of describing and explaining it, which then become the 6-point plan. So we're back to imagination. So the whole project moves back and forth between the imagination and the material. And what I wanted to do, and I don't quite know how to do it, is make a point about how the two are related. To me, it seems that the historians, it should be real good economists, right? Figure out like this economic sentiment led these investors to make these decisions. That's maybe one way to look at how it's related. Or in collecting data about GDP, these are the steamships that were included, or these are the steamships that were included. That's another way of perhaps doing it. But I'm not so sure the historian's method or my training really equips me for that kind of a study. But what I want to say is, in both cases, in the imagination and in the material, the economy that was created out of the colonial economy. Whether it was created out of colonial statistics, whether it was created by going through blue books and census reports and budget figures, or whether it was created by the fleets, the workers, the racial tropes left behind by colonial capitalists. The economy is a post-colonial creation in a very real sense that the colony continues in it, that the colonial continues.